1 week season.
All right. Hello and welcome to week 16's edition of Bias Check. We are checking out the entire week 16 slate on DraftKings, the Sunday slate. And again, welcome back to this podcast. As always, this is a process first DFS show. We are not here to take victory laps on individual lineups or complain about bad beats. We're here to talk about decision making. We're here to talk about the biases that creep in to our lineup builds and how these biases either help us or quietly sabotage us. So every week before we even talk about this slate, we start by checking ourselves on the previous one, right? What did we believe? Why did we believe it? And most importantly, what actions did those beliefs push us toward in our DFS lineups? That is a great exercise for every Sunday night, Monday morning, if you want to review your process. But because DFS isn't just math, it is psychology. And if you don't actively examine your thinking, you're just reacting to projections, ownership, and narratives without really realizing why you are doing it. So today we're going to spend the first chunk of the show reviewing last week's biases, how they showed up most clearly at the running back position, and to examine how a pattern that has worked for most of the season may now be working against us. All right, let's dig in. Actually, before I dig in, I'd just like to say this week's show may be just a touch longer than normal. My goal is to take a lot of the podcasts that we have been, that I have done this year that possibly you have listened, and to kind of take some of the wisdom from all of them and put them into this podcast. So let's begin. Let's review last week's bias. And we're going to start with probably the most obvious example from last week, and that was Woody Marks. Marks ended up as the highest owned running back on the slate. He was sitting right around 30% ownership in most large field tournaments. Now, this wasn't random. There were very real, very logical reasons that people wanted to click his name. And this is where bias really gets interesting because the reasoning wasn't wrong. As we talked about last week and the week before with James Cook, the reasoning was just incomplete. The dominant beliefs driving Mark's ownership were things like strong median projections, a favorable opponent that ranked near last in fantasy points allowed, and perceived volume safety. These are beliefs. Those are beliefs that DFS players trust. They're clean, they're measurable, they feel very responsible. But what happened, and this is the bias, right, is that those beliefs were prioritized while other competing beliefs were quietly pushed aside. Now, not everyone does this, right? But the majority of people, I'm sure this is how their thinking goes. This is how cognitive bias affects us. So things like explosiveness, right? Ceiling outcomes, offensive line quality, and the historical evidence of what a player has actually done with their opportunities, those were kind of pushed to the side. Marks hadn't topped 74 yards rushing all season, we talked about. The offensive line play that he runs behind was still not good. There was no demonstrated path really to a slate-breaking performance unless multiple things broke perfectly for him. So because the projections and the matchup data looked so clean, we treated those signals as truth, when in reality, they were closer to what I like to call untruths that look like truths. All right, and that is an important distinction. These weren't lies, they were just incomplete representations of reality. So when DFS players are under time pressure, we tend to latch on to the cleanest data points, and we ignore the messier ones, especially the ones that force us to question our comfort. This is a classic case of competing beliefs. All right, belief number one is this: the running back projects well and has a good matchup. Belief number two: the running back lacks explosiveness and doesn't have a proven ceiling. When those two beliefs collide, we don't weigh them equally. We default to the belief that feels safer. We default to the belief that is easier to quantify, that's socially reinforced in high ownership. So high ownership acts like a social proof. It tells us you're not alone. Other sharp players agree with you. And that's where the bias really takes hold, because ownership doesn't just reflect information. It also amplifies confidence. So it reflects information and it amplifies confidence. So last week, the action step that was driven by that bias was simple, right? Roster the safe running back, match the field, don't overthink it. And the result, well, a massively owned running back with no ceiling that would separate him from other lineups and no path to winning tournaments. Now, Woody Marks did get injured, of course, in the first half and was not able to complete the second half of that game. His backup running back did come in and put up a score that, if you had combined the two, right, would have produced, a better result that people would have been more happy with. But what I went through was just the thinking that of the two competing beliefs, right? We are not trying to look at results. We're trying to look at the thinking that we put into this process. All right, so now let's zoom out. That's one specific case. Let's zoom out, because this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, a little bit more dangerous. All season long, I've been tracking a very specific pattern at running back from weeks 3 through 13. There was something remarkable that kept holding true. If you rostered 2 to 3 running backs from the top 10 in ownership, how many times have I said that? You are almost guaranteed to have the key running backs needed in order to compete for first place in tournaments. In other words, you could dramatically simplify your decision-making process. You could ignore the fringe plays, ignore the thin narratives, and just focus on the popular running backs. Yeah, there were outliers. Quite often a sub 1% running back was popping off, but they were exceptions, right? Not requirements. And this pattern held for 10 straight weeks. And when a pattern works that consistently, it stops feeling like variance and it starts feeling like truth. But here's the problem, right? Over the last 2 weeks, the pattern broke. Instead of 2 to 3 top 10 owned running backs being optimal, we saw only one useful running back from the top 10. And that was last week. That was Travis Etienne. So the last 2 weeks, we've only seen one out of 20 running backs who, provided useful tournament winning scores. And we also saw tournament winning lineups required hitting the lower owned backs, right? So if you had been sticking to this pattern, the last 2 weeks, the pattern did not help you. And that's where bias creeps back in. Because once a pattern has worked for 10 weeks, our brains don't treat it like a hypothesis anymore. We treat it like a rule. And many of the weeks, that's how I was expressing that and encouraging people to make sort of their decision process a little bit easier. So now we have to ask ourselves an uncomfortable question heading into week 16. Are we still making running back decisions based on current conditions? Or are we anchoring to a pattern that used to be true, right? So are we going to still make running back decisions based on current conditions, or are we anchoring to a pattern that used to be true? This is recency bias layered on top of confirmation bias, right? We noticed a pattern, we benefited from it. So now we are subconsciously looking for reasons to keep applying it, even as the slate dynamics change. And this is the exact moment where good DFS players separate from great ones, right? Not by predicting outcomes, but by recognizing when a helpful bias has turned into a limiting one, recognizing when a shortcut needs to be re-examined, recognizing when what worked is no longer what fits. So as we head into week 16, the goal isn't to blindly fade chalk or blindly trust it. The goal is to ask better questions. Perhaps that's the goal every week. Those questions might look like this, right? What assumptions are we carrying forward? Well, obviously in this case, right? Well, I just have to pick from within the top 10 of running back ownership. which beliefs are we prioritizing? Right. In this case, if I continue with that pattern, I am prioritizing the belief that the running back, the selection of the running back is that simple, among other beliefs. And which ones are we still ignoring, right? Because they're harder to model. Okay, so that's what we're going to dig into next. How to use awareness of these biases to build a smarter running back selection strategy for this slate. So as we move deeper into week 16 prep, I want to expand the running back framework because the slate presents more temptation points than it might appear at first glance. When you open DraftKings and start building lineups, certain running backs are going to pull you toward them immediately. And that pull isn't accidental, right? Let's take an example. Devon Achane, I think the most expensive back this week. He's going to be popular. He's going to be popular for very specific reasons this week. He has the highest median projection on the slate, right? He faces the lowest ranked opponent in fantasy points allowed to the position. And those metrics, right, in the DK app are literally highlighted. They're 2 of the 4 metrics on the DraftKings app that people are going to see while building. So this is a great example of right, the bias of using the interface. You call it like interface driven bias, right? The platform is telling you this is the right guy to play. This is what this is what the data says. This is what sharp looks like, right? Maybe the only thing that's not in there is the price, sort of reflecting on the price. And to be clear, right, we've seen it before. Achane absolutely has a ceiling. He absolutely has had to have it score possibility. But that's not the important question. Can Achane get there, right? He can get there. The important question is, are we selecting Achane because of his true range of outcomes, or because the app or projections are reinforcing our comfort with the pick, right? So he fits that sort of mode of recency bias. He'll likely be high owned, right? And that confirmation bias, he's likely going to be high owned, right? That's going to make him feel comfortable to us. So that distinction matters when ownership climbs and decision-making shortcuts take over. And then there are players like James Cook and Bucky Irving who stand out to me, at least for a different reason. At their respective price points, both have legitimate ceiling outcomes that don't require perfect efficiency. They don't require broken game scripts, right, for them to hit these ceilings. They are backs who often outperform their salary. We've seen it before with each of these. They are often under rostered relative to upside. Bucky Irving has been out much of the year, so we can't maybe make claims on him, but at least James Cook, he's usually under owned relative to his upside. I think last week he was maybe 1 or 2% owned, right? Produced one of the highest scores on the slate. And they quietly end up as core pieces, right, of winning lineups, people who you can play across a lot of lineups. And if they hit, right, you are sort of getting that score that pushes you above other lineups and separates you. So the bias risk here, I guess, is actually the opposite, because they're not really screaming off the page in projections or matchup rankings. They're easier to skip, right? If we're not careful, we end up overweighting visibility instead of potential, right? They're 2 backs who could kind of get missed. Now, ownership is not out. I don't know what ownership will look like, but if they are low owned, right, they might fit into this category. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have the volume and projection driven group this week. That might look like Rico Dowdle, Chase Brown, right, Javonte Williams, Quinshon Judkins, running backs who really carry the sole role on their team, who get a lot of snaps, so they get the volume, right, both targets, touchdown equity, all of that. These are players people will land on because the logic feels airtight, right? The touches are there, the projections are solid, the workload seems stable. But this is where we kind of have to look at last week's lesson. Volume without explosiveness. So volume without explosiveness, volume without a clear path to ceiling can create lineup sameness, right? Without tournament leverage. We're all doing the same thing, but we're not really creating leverage on anyone else. So these backs aren't bad plays, but they are belief heavy plays, right? If you believe in one of them, right, you have to believe that the volume will be enough, that the touchdowns will cooperate, that efficiency won't fall off. So you take a belief, right, or an opinion, and that may be right. You may get that right, just like you kind of put bets on different things, but they shouldn't go unchallenged, right? Especially on a slate where ceiling matters more than safety. So there's going to be a lot of backs like that this week, as there are every week. And then there's Travis Etienne. I expect him to be popular again. Honestly, rightfully so. I'm pretty sure his backup is injured and maybe out this week, which would solidify his role, lock in his volume, right, and reinforce what was already kind of a team philosophy that prioritizes the run, or it's reinforced by that. So from a usage standpoint, Etienne would check a lot of boxes. But this is where belief collision can happen because, right, the two competing beliefs kind of colliding. Because while the volume is real, the matchup this week is extremely difficult for Etienne as he plays Denver. So now we're forced to choose. Do we trust volume and roll certainty? Or do we give weight to matchup, right, and the resistance that we get, right? Sometimes matchup can lower ceiling. And Etienne can only climb so high. The danger, right, is pretending that we don't have to choose, that we can just accept all of it as true. And that's how bias sneaks in, right? Because when you believe something and you're interested in playing it, that confirmation bias is going to pop up, right? And you may again forget to kind of challenge those beliefs. We simplify instead of deciding, right? That's how bias is. We want simple decisions, but we want them to be good. So the framework for week 16, right, is not about choosing the right running back. It's about recognizing why each one feels right. So are we trusting highlighted stats because they're easy to see, like on the app, the 28th ranked opponent? Are we chasing salary relief because it makes roster construction comfortable? And remember, that's what salary relief is. It makes us comfortable with the rosters that we're playing. Are we leaning on season-long patterns, like 10 weeks in a row, the top 10 in ownership at running back hit that may no longer apply? Or are we intentionally selecting backs with real separation potential? So if we can answer those questions honestly, we're not just building better lineups, we're making better decisions. And that's the edge that I am trying to protect this week with this whole discussion on bias around the running back position. Typical of OWS, that discussion doesn't tell us who to play, but it tells me where I'm at risk of letting bias decide for me. And I do not want to let bias decide for me, right? If I'm going to play chalk, I want it to be earned chalk. Hilo often goes over some of that, gives his opinions on that in his end-around article. If I'm going to fade the chalk, I want to be intentional about fading it. And if I'm wrong about it, I want to be wrong for the right reasons, because right, ultimately the right reasons is what's going to make me money over time. If I'm wrong, but I was wrong for the right reasons, right, I will be making better decisions, right? That's going to make me money over time. So the running back discussion, right, it's really helpful because it simplifies one position and it forces us to make intentional decisions instead of the default ones. And so that's focusing in on that running back. Now we need to zoom out because there's another pattern that consistently shows up in the first place tournament lineups. It has nothing to do with being balanced, right? Or solid across the board. It has everything to do with where ceiling scores come from, right? We are after ceiling scores. This matters because if your goal is simply to min cash, you could ignore this, right? If you're playing cash games, but if your goal is to win tournaments, and that's what this podcast is focused on. This is a non-negotiable, right? First place is where the money is, and hitting first place is kind of required to be to have a path towards long-term DFS profitability. So let's kind of look at the other aspects of our lineups this week. At the wide receiver position, the pattern to me is extremely clear. Had to have it scores almost always come from one of two places. Elite volume, right? Usually 12 or more targets. And there are not that many wide receivers who one project for that many targets, or who we could say will get an unexpected volume spike, all right, up to that many targets. Now, if you got like a 3K guy and you can predict a volume spike, or maybe a running back who you can predict a pass volume spike in, again, they can be lower than 12 targets. But usually elite volume is 12 plus targets. That's where you get your had to have it scores, your ceiling scores. It's not about, who has the best cornerback wide receiver matchup, who runs the best routes, who looks explosive on film, right? Or who ball and you feel like it's a good tournament play. Those things help, but they don't create 35-point DFS outcomes, right? Or 40-point DFS outcomes. Targets do. When you look back at first place lineups, the wide receivers that separate, they're not just efficient, they are fed. And this creates an important bias check, right? So we love, based on salary constraints and salaries getting harder to fit in all the plays that we want, we can easily talk ourselves into, wide receivers that are going to get like 6 or 7 targets. We could say, oh, well, if he can get 2 touchdowns, he can produce that score. He hasn't done it all year. He's due, right? Those are hope-based arguments. Sometimes we say, I believe this, and we're actually saying, I hope that this will happen, not ceiling-based ones. If a wide receiver doesn't have a realistic path to double-digit targets or a game environment that could force them, into one, their ceiling really is fragile. And that is something we can operate and take action on. There's another pattern that shows up over and over again in winning lineups. It's what I like to think of as value blocks. And people have been talking about value blocks this week on the Discord quite a lot. These are often, right, 3 to 4 roster spots from the same game or the same team even. And they're usually cheap kind of individually, or within the block, you have at least a pay down option that makes the whole block cheap. So together, they can produce DFS scores that are 4 times their combined salary, put us on pace for 200 points. And this is really important. This is a really important piece to analyze each week. People often think of value as, did this one player hit 4X? That's the wrong frame, right? That is the wrong frame. Winning lineups often say this group of players hit 4X together. All right. Imagine something that has worked a bunch of weeks, a cheap quarterback, a wide receiver or 2, maybe a tight end or a running back. All right. Individually, each of those players would look kind of like a thin, fragile option, and they would be. But collectively, they unlock the entire lineup. Right, things that we should be looking for, and this is where salary relief at this point in the season, right, it stops being something that's like, oh, I'm going to randomly put this little cheap guy in so I can fit everything else I want. And salary relief can actually be a strategic decision. The other major source of had to have it scores is game stacks, specifically shootouts, and not just any shootout. The games that break slates. Right, like last week's Detroit and the Rams game, usually have high total scoring, condensed volume, and clear offensive funnels. Right? I think we talked about that last week with Detroit and the Rams. These games often produce multiple 30-plus point performances, right? Several players exceeding ceiling expectations. And the correlation, right, that you could fit multiple people on this lineup, and all those multiple people combined to put you on pace for 200-plus points. This is where the bias shows up again, because a game stack often looks uncomfortable. There's too many players from one game, right? There's too much risk, too dependent on one outcome. But aren't first place lineups really not meant to be safe, right? You're either first place or it really doesn't matter that much, right? They're built to capitalize on specific outcomes. And when that game environment hits, when that outcome does hit, it doesn't just help one player, it lifts the entire stack. So I know that discussion on value stacks is well known. I think at OWS, we have been talking about that a lot this year, but it's something that I want to put in here and recognize the bias around that idea. All right, now we're going to try and tie things together. And here's the key point that ties everything together. Winning lineups don't just jam in ceiling plays everywhere, right? They mix. They use value plays to intentionally they use value plays intentionally where ceiling is unlikely. All right, and they use value plays to afford true ceiling players where it does exist. Right? That's why the running back discussion matters. That's why the wide receiver volume matters. That's why stacks matter. The lineup isn't trying to be perfect at every position. Remember, perfection is the opposite of a good, or something like that. That was one of my thoughts early on. It's trying to be unstoppable in the right places, right? And that requires us to let go of the belief that every spot needs to hit. But if I'm unstoppable in the right places, when my strategy hits, right, it takes me to the top. Every spot doesn't need to hit, right? They just need to not fail, especially when the ceiling spots are doing the damage. Last week, Ja'Cory Crosskey-Merritt became kind of available on Sunday morning. I switched to him in one of my three lineups. And again, the only reason I didn't do all three is because I just didn't have the time to kind of figure out those other two lineups. But putting him in there, I think he got 15 points, right? He was highly unlikely to fail. And if you were looking for ceiling in a game like Detroit Rams and you needed to find value, he was just such a great play to fit in there. He wasn't going to be the one that won you the slate, right? And you had to kind of know that. You knew that the game stack is what was going to win you the slate. All right, so before building Week 16 lineups, the real bias check is this. Are we chasing comfort? Are we chasing paths to first place? And we all know what the answer to that is, right? Those are not the same thing. If we understand where the ceiling scores actually come from, how correlation multiplies value, how to use cheap pieces as part of a block, right? Not as a one-off, then we're not just reacting to projections. We're building lineups that are actually capable of winning. And that's the entire point of DFS. All right, so let's kind of go through let's kind of put this, I kind of put all together at the end of this because that's a lot of thoughts. Just a checklist. Call it the first place checklist. So I would encourage you at this point to kind of look through the slate this week, look through the games, right? What are those game stacks? What are the value stacks? Often if you are an Inner Circle member and you have access to JM's journal, those are many of the things that he is looking at, and he's kind of giving you those ideas this week. I would always do your own research because he doesn't hit on everything, or sometimes he is working with some ideas catch on to an early idea and sort of ride that all the way through the week. And maybe one of those late ideas is really the value or is really the gold. So I encourage you to kind of make your own thoughts about all of these things first. Read someone else who's thinking like you. Check out the OWS Discord, where people are always sort of putting in kind of these blocks, ideas about blocks that a value that can hit for Forex. Again, that might save you some time. So you can kind of just check out what other people are looking at. So, okay, so let me get into this checklist. This isn't about whether a lineup can cash, of course. It's about whether a lineup can win. Most DFS lineups don't fail due to bad plays. They fail because they never gave themselves a realistic path to first place. So here are some questions that I'm asking I'm asking of every lineup before I click submit this week. And I would encourage you to do so. Where is my 35 to 40 point score coming from? You will need that to win. This is the most important question and often the one that most people skip. Every first place lineup needs at least one true ceiling score, right? Not I did well, not I beat salary, right? We need a score that breaks the slate. So based on this slate, those almost always come from elite volume wide receivers, condensed shootout environments. So I'm asking, right? And these are just my picks that I'm about to give you. And in fact, they're not picks. They're just elite volume wide receivers in condensed shootout environments, right? Do I have Amon-Ra St. Brown this week? Do I have Jamar Chase, Mike Evans, Chris Olave, Drake London, or, some other wide receiver who can realistically get there? Or am I hoping my ceiling comes from efficiency? Right? If my best wide receiver caps out at 22, 24, 25 points, I'm not really building a first place lineup. I'm building a reasonable one. So I need at least one wide receiver who has that break the slate 35, 40 point ceiling. My second question, am I playing wide receiver ceiling through volume, not hope? This is a bias checkpoint, right? If a wide receiver is in my lineup and you get 3 or 4 of them, I want to know, how does he get to double-digit targets, right? Or what causes a volume spike? Right? Remember, first-place wide receivers are fed. They're not just the talented ones. So if I'm talking myself into, right, that idea, he only needs one long TD. He can hit for that, or the defense is bad. That's hope-based bias, right? That's a belief. There are competing beliefs. Volume is the only repeatable ceiling driver at wide receiver when you're rostering one-offs and things like that. Another question, my third question, do I have a correlated value block that can hit 4x together? Winning lineups almost always have a value block unless they have sort of the game over stack, not just value plays, but a value block. So I'm checking, do I have 3 to 4 players from the same team or game? Are they cheap individually and explosive collectively? Right? This is where on this slate, I think you can look at some of these games. Right? Tampa Bay at Carolina. Again, they have kind of the cheap, collectively cheap groupings of players. And again, you could choose one of those teams or both of those teams. Atlanta at Arizona. Now, Arizona might look expensive, but if you look at their production, they're actually not that expensive. So while those wide receivers, Michael Wilson, the tight end, Trey McBride, look expensive on Atlanta, Bijan Robinson, Drake London, right? They're actually priced well for their production. Jacksonville at Denver, right? These are places where I think we can look. Again, I think we can look for these value blocks this week. These games allow for a cheap quarterback, 1 or 2 pass catchers, possibly a running back or a tight end. And if that block right hits, it kind of unlocks everything else. If you find a block that you like there, that you think can kind of get that 4x score, you put that into 10 lineups and you kind of mix and match these other ideas around it, right? That's what we mean by unlocking. It's not what carries you to over the top, but it is kind of what unlocks the other pieces that can carry you over the top. So just another line here that I kind of liked. You could write it somewhere, put it on your desk. Scattered value feels safe, but rarely wins tourneys. Right? Scattered value feels safe, but rarely wins tourneys. Number 4, does my lineup tell a story that ends in chaos? First place requires chaos, right? Not balance. And chaos within, the individual games. So I ask, what has to go right for this lineup to win? And is that outcome plausible? Right. For example, a game can flip pass heavy unexpectedly. That's a little bit chaotic, right? Or a thin game. I don't have any examples right now, but a thin game, goes into what Hilo calls the oh shit mode in the second half, right? Or one offense forces another to abandon their plan. One offense forces the other to become more pass heavy, something like that. If my lineup requires everything to go according to plan, like, oh, here, I have diagnosed how every game is going to go this week, and my lineup requires that to happen. Or even here's the 5 games that I'm most confident on, and my lineup, and here's how I think each of these games goes. And my lineup, is built around all of these games, little pieces from each of them. And if everything goes according to plan, I win. Well, that's a red flag, right? The probability of that is so low. The best lineups benefit when plans break. So think about that. Does your lineup tell a story that ends in chaos? If so, it's got a chance to take first place. Number 5, am I using running backs to avoid failure or to create ceiling? Right. This ties directly back into the running back discussion. Running backs don't usually win you tournaments, right? Because a lot of times we're rostering chalky running backs, but they can lose them. So I ask, are my running backs preventing lineup failure? Or are they preventing lineup failure, right? Am I going for the median projection? Or am I sort of accidentally expecting them to be the ceiling piece? Often those running backs that are ceiling pieces, right, are high owned, and you still need to differentiate somewhere else. If my lineup relies on a mid-range running back to score 30 or a cheap running back to smash, well, that's fragile thinking. It can happen, right? But maybe that's just one path towards winning. Running backs really should stabilize. Wide receivers and stacks should detonate. It's kind of one way to think about it. And again, that may be confusing. The other week, Jahmyr Gibbs scored, right, 50-something points. He was also like 50% owned. You had to have him to win. And he felt like it was a detonation, right? But he was really just a stable piece of winning rosters, and they needed to differentiate elsewhere. Number 6 of this checklist, where am I intentionally eating chalk and why? Every winning lineup has chalk. The difference is intentional chalk. So I ask, is this chalk elite volume or elite ceiling chalk? Is it comfort chalk driven by projections, matchup ranks, right? If I am eating chalk, what I really wanted to do is I want to believe that the ceiling is real. I want to eat chalk that has real ceiling. Or like if Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt had become chalk, if he had been a known entity earlier, he probably would have been chalk, right? And sometimes that value chalk is something you also want to eat because it unlocks other parts of your lineup. So if I'm eating chalk, I want it to have a ceiling, not because I didn't want to think too. I think I got into that boat a little bit the last few weeks with this pattern of the top 10 owned running backs saying, this is one place I don't have to think. It was probably that was definitely a bias that I let myself sort of fall prey to. So we still need to think about every position, but some of those decisions we can simplify. Number 7, if this lineup wins, this is what I love. If this lineup wins, what was the headline, right? What are people going to say about the week that made this a winning lineup? If it wins a tournament, right, what would the recap say? This week, something like, at the end of the week, if someone says, wow, Atlanta and Arizona explodes, and the condensed stacks on that, sort of dominated the top of the leaderboards, right? Well, that how to build a lineup, right? If that is the story at the end of the week. Here's another one, again, sort of from my thinking. Tampa Bay, usually a pass funnel defense, forces Bryce Young into 50 attempts. Yeah, if that happens, right, we're going to want to have those Carolina value stacks. That makes a lot of sense. Or one of these high-priced wide receivers, gobbled up 14 targets in a shootout. Well, yeah, I know a 14-target wide receiver is going to have a great chance at a ceiling game. But if I can't clearly articulate the story behind the players that I rostered, the lineup probably is not sharp enough. You need to go back and do something else. That's why I love this question. First place always makes sense in hindsight. Have you ever checked out first place rosters? You're just like, wow, that makes so much sense. But it should make sense in advance too. And this is a checklist that you can go back through. I'm actually going to post this on the Discord. I don't know if I can pin it, but I'll try to post this checklist on the Discord in the OWS Inner Circle community. So just a recap, this checklist really isn't about predicting outcomes. It's about making sure that my ceiling comes from the right places, right? My value is correlated. My running backs don't sabotage me. And my decisions are driven by paths to first place, not comfort. If I miss, right, and it's okay to miss as long as we make good decisions, I want to miss on purpose. If I lose, I want to lose for the right reasons, right? That's how you stay profitable in DFS over the long term. All right, friends. All right, OWS family. That is a lot this week. You may want to re-listen to this. Again, I'll post some of this in the Discord. Again, go through your planning this week. Think about the biases. Hopefully, if you have been listening to this podcast throughout the season, a lot of the stuff I'm saying is repetition, but it's combining it in a way that is going to allow us to kind of build good lineups. This is also helping me to create another course. It'll be our third course on recognizing biases that'll be up in the off season that can help you kind of prepare for next season. Thank you. Good luck on week 16. And as always, see you at the top of the leaderboards.